Good afternoon, everybody, or morning, depending upon where you're at. Today's presentation, we're going to be talking about cybersecurity documentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to fill out the question chat, and we will get to those questions. And if you have any questions after you're watching this recorded, you can go ahead, go to my blog at learnsecurity.org, fill out the form, and submit a question. You can also submit ideas for future webinars if you're interested. Today joining me, I have Robert from Indiana University. He'll be joining us here shortly. And I have Ron Puccinelli from the city of Fairfield, who's also joining to add his comments in and some of the challenges that some of the local governments may have in some of the cybersecurity documentation we'll talk about here today. So to start off, people oftentimes will talk about policies, plans, and procedures, and what I find as an auditor when I go in, especially when I'm dealing with local governments, is there isn't always a clear understanding of the difference between a policy, a procedure, and a plan. And when I go in and do a review and look at it, sometimes they have procedural level things in a policy and policy level things in a procedure. The wrong or not the best location for, or the best place in management for those policies to be approved at. So we're going to talk about some of that today, talk about the differences between them, talk about what you should include in a policy, like what should a policy kind of look like, what are procedures and what should they have, and then I'm going to talk about how plans are different. What's the difference between a procedure and a plan, and why do you need plans, and what kind of plans do you need? And then we'll talk about some of the supporting documentation. So all of that, you take all of that for an organization, whether it be a local government or a small business, that becomes the documentation that you have, your cybersecurity documentation. And of course, there's going to be overlap with this, with other policies and procedures that you already have in place. For example, in cybersecurity, you may have to have a policy on doing background checks for employees. Well, that may already exist in another location in the HR, Human Resources Department, and they may already have a policy for all of that. So, when I'm going to talk about cybersecurity, obviously, but understand that it sometimes is a little bit broader within an organization. So I wanted to start off by showing you just this little graphic that kind of talks about like what are policies, procedures, and plans and supporting documentation and how they kind of all fit together. So when you're looking at cybersecurity documentation in general, you have at a high level the policies. And for, let's say you're a local government, this is something that council, if you're a city council would, if you're a county, it may be the Board of Supervisors, this is their statement to staff on what they expect. So at the highest level, that's what we're talking about when we talk about policies. Procedures will be at a lower level, and procedures are going to be more like the step-by-step instructions on how to implement those policies. How do you set up a new user account? Who is responsible for X or Y? Plans would also kind of be very similar to procedures, and we'll talk about the difference here in a little bit, but plans like an incident response plan, a disaster recovery plan, those types of items would also be documented. We'd hope they were documented. It's hard to have a disaster recovery plan when you don't have a plan at all, and then you try to implement one. It can be very, very troubling, I guess, is a good way to put it. And then supporting documentation. So there's all kinds of other documentation that I, as an auditor, look for. Inventories is one of the big ones. Do you have an inventory of all your hardware? Do you have an inventory of all your software? Do you have an inventory of all your data types? Those are the big three that we really look for. But that's one of the things that falls under supporting documentation. There'll be a whole bunch more, because like, what about standards and guidelines that exist? Those become supporting documentation as well, and we'll get more into that. But I want you to understand that there's a hierarchy here between a policy and a procedure. And why document anything? So I had to ask Ron, like, not why you do it, but why as an auditor, when I go out to a city or something like that, do you have a hard time getting things documented?
The biggest challenge is people are so busy they don't want to necessarily take the time to sit down and do the documentation, to put the inventory together, that kind of thing. But when the auditors show up, it raises the department's credibility, the division's credibility, when you can say, here's my inventory, here's my set of policies, here's my supporting documentation. It demonstrates to the auditors and to the organization itself that A, you know what you're doing, and B, that you are prepared in case something happens.
Right, and I think that's perfect. I mean, I'll be honest, as an auditor, when I go to a place and when I go there and I show up and they give me a CD-ROM or a USB stick and say, here's all our documentation, I love it, because at least I know I have a starting place to go to, and I can see what it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it, right? That's what an auditor has to do. We have to go and test all that, but it at least tells me that they have an idea of what they're supposed to be doing, right? So for some instances, you need to have policies and procedures and documentation for compliance reasons. A big one that you have to do is for PCI. So if you're taking credit cards in any way, shape, or form, there's documentation that's required. And there's quite a bit of documentation that's actually required for it, depending upon how you process credit cards. So there's a lot for compliance. If you are implementing any other standards like NIST's Cybersecurity Framework or NIST 853, there are also requirements for policies and procedures in there and other documentation as well. One of the things that we look at this is for due diligence sake. So, for example, there's been cases in court. There was one, and I think we talked about it at our last webinar, recently, court cases where companies that weren't doing what they knew they should be doing were fined extra, right? So, so you want to be able to do is demonstrate that you're doing your due diligence, which is, I think, what Ron was saying. I mean, it's basically, hey, I want to show council, if you're a city, or the board of directors, or whoever else is your governing body, that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? So that's your due diligence, and that helps in court too if there's a breach.
The other piece that the documentation really helps with is, even if you're a smaller organization and you can't go through all of the steps, all 750 some odd controls and things like that, it demonstrates to auditors, it demonstrates to your governing bodies that you've at least had the conversation and made a thoughtful decision about what risk am I going to accept and what risk am I going to try and mitigate and what risk am I going to transfer through insurance and things like that. So as Don was saying, it's demonstrating your due diligence. It's not that you necessarily can achieve every single thing that's required, but at least you've given it some thought and made a conscious decision, informed decision about what you are going to do and what you're not going to do. And now everybody in the chain of command knows what's going on.
Right. And I think one of the reasons why, and procedures are always, because a lot about what we've been talking about is kind of like policy-based, but on a procedural level, one of the reasons why we look for that is to get better quality in a process, whatever the process is. And the process may be setting up a new user. And what we find is that system admins just assume that they know what they're doing, and I've done this 100 times before, so I don't need any help. I don't need to look at a checklist, or I don't need to look at procedures for it. But that's where we typically end up with an issue, in that one time it doesn't happen. The user didn't get it set up correctly. They have too much privileges, or they weren't set up in the right groups, and those types of things. And that's why when we are asking for procedures, we're looking at the quality, because people are the weakest link, right? It's not automated. If we can automate something, then that's great. Then we don't necessarily have to have a procedure in place. We might want to have it documented, though, how it's supposed to work, the automated process, and why it's being done. You might have an auditor such as me ask you if you've done that kind of documentation, but not all auditors will do that. Also, this helps decrease risk to the organization overall. Obviously, if there's a compliance reason for you to have it, then that control is considered and been deemed by the industry as being important enough to reduce risk. So that's So I have to say, yes, the auditor is going to ask for it. That's one of the reasons that you have to have it. Sorry. But also just it raises awareness. And I'm a strong advocate of saying that I know that a lot of local governments, maybe the city manager is the one that approves some of the policies. I really believe, from a governance perspective, that we really want city councils buy-in on this, and they're the ones that need to approve the policies. Maybe the highest level policy, maybe not all the other lower policies, and we'll talk about the different levels of policies as well. So at least that they have some skin in the game, that they understand, because technically they're the ones that are supposed to assign the risk level that's tolerable for the organization. It's the governing board, whoever that is. If it's city council, board of supervisors, doesn't matter. They're the ones that are supposed to say, we have low risk tolerance, or we're willing to allow, greater latitude and understand that there's more risk. So that's their responsibility to do that. So I want to make sure that they're involved in the process, and that's part of the governance process. Another thing to look at too, when we're looking at having things documented, it's really about a maturity level of an organization. And if you're not an auditor, you may not be familiar with things like COBIT or the CMMI, which is basically a maturity matrix that basically says, hey, we look at every control this way. So setting up new user account, that's a control. So we're going to ask you, hey, do you have it? If you don't have a process or anything, you don't set up new users, I guess that's not really one that would be a 0. But if the control doesn't exist, you're at the lowest level, non-existent. If you do, but it's not, it's kind of ad hoc, and it's kind of whenever, it's not repeatable, it's just kind of haphazard, that's a level 1. A level 2 is something where, yeah, admins know and they're doing it, it's just not documented. This is where I find most of my clients is at that level 2. Well, we know what we need to do, we're doing it, no big deal. But if you want to get a higher maturity level, you've got to get into the point of documenting it so that it's a known process. And then getting to managed and optimized, that's when you start to add in quality assurance, other checks and balances to that same control. So at a level 5 on a control, like you're setting up new user accounts, that means it would be documented. You'd also have potentially a way of automating some of that process. Maybe a human initiates it in HR, and then there's an automated process that it provisions the account, but then there's an additional step that the admin has to do to actually set up the new user account. So there's like 2 levels of control. But then also taking any faults that happen through that process, any mistakes, and then putting that back into the beginning of the process and saying, how do we change the process so we don't have that mistake again in the future? That's like the quality assurance. If you're familiar with like Six Sigma and just ISO 9000, that idea of taking feedback from failed attempts or tasks and putting that back into the process to better the process in the future. So if you want to get to that higher level, level 5, that's what you need to be doing. Either completely automate it and test it, or be able to get quality out of it. Yes?
One reason you might want to consider going to the higher level, the 4 or the 5, particularly if you are in the market for cyber insurance or anything of that nature, this will be part of what the insurance companies will want to see and will want to test on an annual basis. And the further along you are in that maturity spectrum, up to a 4 or ideally a 5, means you will have a much easier time of getting cyber insurance coverage, and the cost for that insurance will be much less. So there is actually a financial incentive here to do it. It allows you to transfer more risk to the insurance market and to do that for a lower cost.
Right. And that's a great point. I mean, it's about saving money too, right? Because usually budget seems to be an issue too, right?
Budget is always an issue.
And if you look at the graph here, I kind of show you what COBIT's maturity matrix looks like. But also, if you think about it, the risk is going to be higher that the control fails if it's non-existent, obviously, right? But if it's initial or repeatable, it's becoming less and less likely to fail. But if you're at a level 5, the risk that it's going to fail is going to be extremely low. So if you look at it from that level too, you're moving your way towards lower risk for your organization overall, which I'm sure is what every organization wants. They don't want to be hacked by anybody. So policies. Good thing to think about policies is basically what they are is management's directives, right? What is supposed to be done. What I see a lot of organizations do is they end up making it way too detailed. It needs to be high level. It doesn't need to be super detailed. You can have lower procedures that have the more detail in them. The other thing with policy is you try to get the policy to apply to the entire organization. So, for example, if you're going to have a high-level policy about cybersecurity, you might want to say, for access control, as one of the policies, you may want to just say, you're going to set up access control and based upon the system, implement control that's multi-factor or two-factor or passwords with X amount of complexity. That gets to get a little detailed, so maybe the policy, you don't want to have all that information in it. Maybe you say that you say using industry standards or something like that, or point to another industry standard in the policy. So the policy can have a lifetime longer than, a year. Ideally, you don't want to go back every 6 months because technology's changed to council to have them redo a policy. So your policies kind of need to be broad and be able to be applied. If you have an access control policy, it has to apply to everything that you have. So how do you do that? You can't be very specific about passwords because you may have an access control policy that doesn't have passwords. Now what? So now you're violating the policy? Well, as an auditor, I'm going to look at it and say, well, your policy says you have to do this. And you say, well, this doesn't capable to do that. Well, then you shouldn't be using that. Or change the policy. I mean, it's one or the other, right? So you're trying to get this to be like a 5-year life cycle, at least. But, well, it's the average, right? Average is, it's not, I mean, you can make it 3 years or whatever it is. You should review them every year. That should be part of the process. And staff should give feedback to council or the governing board to say, this policy doesn't work, or we need to change the policy, or this is another thing that we need to add to the policy. 9 times out of 10, if you're like in a local government, you're going to draft the policy and then council would then approve it, right? So, but anyways, also remember there's multiple levels of policy. So you can have an overall policy that is approved by board of council, and then that could delegate responsibility at a lower level for other items, other policy items. I get the question all the time, and so I'll just answer it right now. Do we have to call them policies and procedures? No, you don't. You can call them whatever. I went to one organization, they called them rules. I don't know why, but that's what they call them. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. You can call them whatever you want to call them. It just needs to make sure that we fit into these templates of what a policy and what a procedure is. And there's good reasons why to keep them separate. The other thing, because there's different levels of policies, there's an enterprise-wide security policy we have. And going back to some of NIST's older documents that have now been redacted, they actually had system-specific or issue-specific policies. System-specific might be a firewall policy, like how to implement the firewall, and at a policy level, you would just have a very high thing that you should restrict connections and it should only open up connections to known good traffic or whatever. A very high level like that. That would be a system-specific. Access control and Active Directory, that would be system-specific policy. Issue-specific would be like a terms of use or Wi-Fi use or something like that, because that's more of an issue and not a system. So it just, and do you have to label these things as issue-specific or system-specific? No. Again, NIST just kind of categorized the different types of policies to make it easier to talk about, but you don't have to label them as such. As an auditor, I do, because I'm looking for certain things, but you don't have to get into all of that specifics there. Another question I do get is, can we have one policy that covers all those little items, or should we have multiple little ones? That's a preference for the organization. As an auditor, I don't care. I'm looking to see if things are documented and people are following it. That's it.
On this, if you do anything like a federated IT approach to if you're a larger organization, and maybe you have your SCADA system is operated by a different group than your IT group, this also gives you the ability to say, at the policy level, this applies to everybody no matter where it is, but now each sub-team, your SCADA team, your IT team, needs to have their own individual policies about how they secure and operate and maintain the systems.
Right. That's a good point. In this slide, I'm just trying to show one thing, because we're going to have another session here in the future about the difference between IT governance and IT management and why they're both different. But basically, governance is something that reports up to the board level or the supervisor level, and basically what it's trying to do is make sure that the risks are being addressed, that they're being mitigated, that there's transparency, and that the organization is doing their due diligence. That's what it's all about, right? And so policies become an important part of that, because policies are demonstrating that the governance exists, right? At least the framework of the governance. It doesn't mean the governance is actually being carried out. I mean, if council says that annually they want to report on how everything is going, and then they don't follow through to get that report, then there's a breakdown there, right? But the idea of the policy is the first step. You need to have the policies, and then the follow-through, obviously, to make sure that they're being followed. IT management is going to be the day-to-day operations, the system life cycle, so to speak. Everything that's involved in just making sure that data is available and systems are secure, all of that is a part of the management aspect of it. So the governance part is really where the documentation comes in, because that's what that documentation is trying to do, is the IT governance, or at least support it. Mm-hmm. So on a procedural level, these are going to be those step-by-step instructions that you're going to have for your system admins or whoever, it may not necessarily be system admins, because you could have HR actually provisioning accounts. So whoever's doing whatever part of the cybersecurity, this is their step-by-step instructions. So think of it as, this is the tactical implementation of the policy, right? Policy being more strategical, saying, hey, this is the overall, this is what we want you to do. Have access control that, limits access to need to know, or limit access to only what is necessary to do one's job. Now the procedures would then implement how that is done. So somebody has to go through and say, okay, the policy says this, so how do we design a procedure in there that meets this criteria, meets industry standards, whatever. You document it, so that way you know that it's in line with the policies when you start off. And this makes sure that there's alignment within the organization, so that the overall point of all of this is making sure that the organization can continue its mission, whatever that is. If you're a water district, then you're making sure that water is moving and being cleaned, or whatever it is. You want to make sure that you're making that mission. So everything really should be in alignment to make sure that the overall organization does it. And if it relies upon IT, IT needs to make sure that it does that. These things are going to change as needed. For example, if you have an access control procedure that says to set up a new user, click this, do that, and then you update the software, and now the software now changes it. It's not on this tab, it's on another tab. Well, then you need to change the procedure. And this is not something that you want to have to go back to council with to say, hey, we need to change this because the vendor changed something. Council's not really interested in that level of detail. One, two, it needs to be in a procedure anyways, and then you can just update it. Now, that doesn't mean you just update anything willy-nilly. There should be a change control process to make sure that someone's looked at it, that the change makes sense, and then they implement the change, and then they change the documentation so that the system admins know. Generally, you would have somebody separate from the system admins who is a part of the change control board that would look at all the changes. The system admins would be the ones notifying or putting in a request for the change, and then somebody would look at the documentation and say, yes, we need to change the documentation, change it, and get it approved, and then get it distributed.
One thing that many organizations find helpful in this change control process is having a second set of eyes on it, as Don was mentioning. So the sysadmin requests the change, but the second set of eyes then comes back and says, well, what's the impact of the change? What else changed because of this change? If we click tab 1 instead of tab 2, does that give an individual rights they wouldn't normally otherwise have or should have? But you want to make sure that in your change control process you're looking at what's the intended as well as the unintended consequences as best you can, right, of that any given change.
Yeah, and part of that is also assessing what the risk is, right? So if you have to change something completely by the way that you're doing something, does that introduce more errors? Does it could it lead to the control failing more often? Those types of things become questions that we have to ask during that change control process. So management can make an informed decision, right?
Yep.
And the whole point of all of this is to have better processes. This is where you would find ITIL, our Microsoft Operations Framework, fits into this category right here because they're all about documenting things. They're all about the change control and controlling that process in order to reduce risk and to get you better uptime and better availability and better, confidentiality with your systems. So that's really what they're focusing in on. So if you see ITIL or MOF, one of those type of frameworks that your organization's using, it's really focusing in on this aspect right here of the change control program. And they're going to want you to have procedures for just about everything. And I guess a good question is, do you have to have a procedure for everything? Okay, so if I'm an auditor and there's a standard that says you should have a procedure for it, then I have to say yes. Now, let's talk about the reality. The reality is you probably can't make a procedure for everything. So what you need to do is you need to figure out which processes are most susceptible to error, and those are the ones that are going to have the highest risk. Now, you also have to look at the impact. If this control fails, does it matter? No. Okay, well, then maybe we're not worried about making a procedure for this. Well, if this control fails and it exposes your network to, hackers, or it gives people more privileges than they should have, that's going to have a high impact, right? So you're going to want to look at the risk and the impact of control failure to determine whether or not it's acceptable to lower or not have procedures. And those higher ones you want to have the procedures for, right? So that's the risk-based approach, and auditor-based approach is just make them all. But that becomes a lot of paperwork.
Yeah. And Don makes a great point. Taking a risk-based approach, because you can't do everything all at once, particularly if you're starting at a lower level of the CMM, capability maturity model. You don't want to try and boil the ocean. So take the risk-based approach. Focus on those things that have the biggest impact, that provide the most protection. Do them first, and then slowly work down the risk scale until you've gotten to where your risk profile says you and your organization are comfortable.
Right. So plans, what's the difference between a plan and a procedure? Well, a procedure is you can do it step-by-step. Do this, do this, do this. For disaster recovery, you can't really come up with a procedure that covers every possible contingency. That's impossible. So you have to have like a general guideline, so to speak, of how you're going to deal with a disaster, like triaging, like setting up dependencies and making sure dependencies are put in place, because if the dependency is not in place, it doesn't matter if you recover that server, it's not going to be accessible, right? So I can bring back a server, but if I have no network, what good is it, right? Nobody can access it. And this is a big thing too, because if you have Active Directory is necessary for authentication. So guess what? It's like one of the first things you have to put up. But it has dependencies. Mm-hmm. It needs a network to run on. It needs DNS and DHCP usually set up. So those items have to come as well as Active Directory. So you have to bring all that up before you can bring up a system that may have single sign-on with Active Directory. So having a plan of action to know that this is what you're supposed to do. Notice I didn't say there's a step one to recovering Active Directory. You should still have a procedure someplace that says, here's that backup and here's how to do recovery for Active Directory. Hopefully you have something like that. That plan that you have, the disaster recovery plan, would reference it with that other procedure someplace else. You don't want to put all those procedures in a disaster recovery plan, because then it's going to be like 900 million pages long and nobody's going to be able to find what they're looking for anyways. Because you can't cover every contingency. What are you going to do if an earthquake? What are you going to do if it's a fire? So you just have to kind of plan generally. And what I find that a lot of people do is they get really wrapped around the axle on this and they make it much more complicated than it needs to be. I'm all for just keep it simple, right? Keep it as simple as possible. Just go for, okay, small disasters, the loss of, a rack or a server or a data center, all the way up to loss of all, functionality in IT. Well, how would you recover from that? If you can recover from that, then you could probably recover from smaller outages as well, depending upon what they are. So plan for general and plan for like a total loss, and then smaller items as they come up. You can plan for those separately if necessary. Because I can think of a couple instances where, like, if it's a server went down or your VM infrastructure went down, recovering that may not be as, it's not a complete loss, right? So you may even just flip a switch and move it to the cloud or something along those lines. So it gives you direction when you cannot come up with a procedure to define every little aspect of it. Typical ones that you're going to see are incident response plans and disaster recovery plans. Now, in the risk management framework, which 853, NIST 853 kind of dovetails off of the risk management framework, they also have a system security plan. That's less of a plan in the traditional sense of what I just explained a plan to be, and that is you're just documenting how your controls are in place, and it's basically documenting your due diligence. You document the types, you document what your system is, you document the data that's on the system, you document any of the connections to the system, you document any external requirements to that system, and then you document all the 853 controls that you have and how you've implemented them, right? That's the system security plan from the risk management framework. This is a very invaluable document, and a lot of local governments kind of, when they say, hey, you should use NIST 853, they scratch their head. They don't know what to do. And then on top of that, the federal government has some specific controls in there that are federal government specific controls that don't apply to a local or state agency. So they scratch their head and say, I don't understand how we're supposed to implement this. And we'll do another class on that, how to implement the risk management framework and cybersecurity framework. What they did is they came up with a cybersecurity framework for critical infrastructure, but that is a subset and less than 853. Mm-hmm. So you're not doing yourself any favor by just implementing the cybersecurity framework. That's like, okay, we got to start with baby steps, so let's give them something they can start with, but it's not really the full package. You really want to be able to get and implement 853. And by the way, if you're implementing 853, almost every control that is in the cybersecurity framework, and if you look at the little list there, they all relate back to a control in 853. And by the way, 853 is going through another revision. It's in draft right now, and a new one's going to come out soon. They're implementing privacy into it as a part of it. So here's the thing. If you look at that plan, or you look at like 853, one of the things that it says that you should do is have a plan of action milestones, which is a very specific OMB requirement, how you fill it out. But what the control is, the nature of the control, is that you should have a remediation list of controls that are not in place, and you should have some type of budgetary process to submit those things so that the budget can be applied to them. Everybody should have that, right? That is a common control that you should have. So even if it's federal government specific, doesn't necessarily mean as a local or state government or even a small business that you shouldn't be doing that. You really should be doing it. And so anyways, that's where the plans come in. Now, what about supporting documentation? There's all kinds of supporting documentation. And just to go over a couple of them with you, these are things that kind of support what you're doing. Like an inventory is like, it supports the plan of action. It's your plans. It supports your policies and procedures. What about how-tos? Telling people how to do, scan a file into the scanner and send it to yourself. Like, is there how-tos on how to do that? How to do it safely and correctly? Right? Those types of things you would want to have. Reference materials, manuals for all the different software and applications that you have, any types of lists or checklists that you have. You may have a checklist. Like configuration management, you oftentimes have checklists that say, okay, make sure these systems have all these things turned on. Guidelines and standards. Now, we'll talk about those separately, so I'm going to put them on the side burner here. And then we'll pick them up in the next slide here. Statistics become another important part of the documentation you may want to have. Like, how often do we get hit with spam or viruses or phishing attempts? That's a really important piece of tactical information that you need in order to make a risk-based decision on something. If you're getting hit a lot, like we look at our DNS firewall to see what people are clicking on, and just we look at and see how many people are clicking on malware-related sites, and that tells me that the risk is high. right? So then we're looking to figure out how we can lower that. So those statistics kind of help make decisions in that process. So that's what that's for. Contracts or service level agreements you may have, licenses, memorandum of understandings, laws, right? You may have a law that you have to follow. The civil code for California has a requirement for local governments that they have to do breach disclosure, and it covers some very specific items, and it covers some very specific requirements on how you are to report it and who you are to report it to and time periods for all of that. So it's kind of important that you reference those things to make sure that your policies and procedures are going to make sure that you're compliant with that. Logs, maintenance records, configuration files, settings, diagrams. Big one that you have is like in the NIST risk management framework in the federal government side, they need to have a diagram of their networks. They need to have a data flow diagram. Data flow diagrams are also required for PCI, for your PCI cardholder data environment. So diagrams become an important part of that. It helps you see what your organization or what your network looks like or how your data is flowing across it. And it helps you make the decisions on where firewalls need to be, where you can do segmentation. All of that is a part of that.
I could just tack on to what Don is saying here about supporting documentation. This also arms you with the information to take back up your chain of command up to your governing body to say, you've set these policies and procedures. This is how we're delivering on that. It helps you tell the story of why they need to maintain awareness, why they need to maintain compliance, why they need to care about risk and managing the risk in a cybersecurity environment. It also helps establish your credibility that when you have an event, and most of us will, it's not the first time they're hearing from you about what is going on and how you're protecting things. So it gives them a way to evaluate, well, we've been hearing this all along, and here's how it's been working. We had an event. This is what was done to remediate that event, and it just helps you tell the story successfully to your chain of command about how you've responded.
Yeah, and that becomes, I think that's one of the key points is you want to make sure that you don't have an incident and then you go to the board and say, oh, by the way, I need all this stuff now. And they're going to be like, why weren't you asking for that before?
Yeah.
Right? So you want to kind of address it before there's an issue. And sometimes you don't get support until there is an issue. You can listen to my last webinar last week where a city that got hit with, one of those phishing attempts, and then they fell for it. And then before that, it was difficult to get stuff done. After it, it becomes a lot easier. But at least the conversation started before, right? So management knew that, IT has been telling us that we need to do this. So standards and guidelines. Standards and guidelines, difference between those two. Standards you should consider, if the standard is applied to you and you have to follow it, then you have to follow it. It's basically, you should consider it non-optional. You have to do it. It's just, that's the way it is. So it's required. For the federal government, they have Federal Information Processing Standards. Those are very high-level statements. They're like policies. They're not very prescriptive. They just say, hey, you're going to take and implement controls like FIPS 199 or FIPS 200, which is the basis for FISMA and the risk management framework. They're very high-level statements that say you should use risk-based approach to implementing cybersecurity. Okay, great. So we use a risk-based approach. Now, the guidelines, NIST special publications, all delineate what that means. Now, guidelines are a little bit more flexible, and if you've done a lot of work in the federal government and different agencies, you will find out how flexible it is because different agencies do different things different ways, right? And then when you have local governments trying to implement also the same NIST guidelines, because they're not required to follow FIPS, because that's for federal information processing, so it's just recommended that they use NIST. So when they try to implement NIST, they're going to have to change some things. Remember we talked about the federal government specific items? Well, they're going to have to change that. So some states have adopted, all right, we're going to use 853, but take these controls out, or some of the controls will say check logs every, and then there's a blank for a time period. And then some agencies will then pick in and say, okay, the time period is going to be this, weekly, monthly, whatever it is. So some states have done that and just said, okay, this is what we're going to do for state agencies, not necessarily for local governments. But local governments should still do the same thing. And if you want an idea of what some of those could be, NSA has it for national security systems. They have a very rigid one. So if you're doing it that good, then you should lower your risk really low. But other standards that you're going to fall into is PCI DSS. And that's different. We all, when people say standards, they say 853 and they say PCI DSS. PCI DSS is actually a standard, and Special Publication 853 is actually a guideline. There's a difference. PCI, you have to follow it. If you're processing credit cards, whoever signed up for it, somebody maybe in finance or whatever, signed up to process credit cards, and in that agreement it says you're going to be PCI DSS compliant. That means if you're not, you're going to be liable for losses. So and it's a standard. There's no flexibility in it. The only thing that you can do is if you don't have wireless and there's a control that says wireless, you can put non-applicable. That's the only thing you can do. Otherwise, everything is supposed to be in place. On the NIST side of things, you can go to the control and you can say, well, I looked at this control. Yes, we have that, but we're going to accept the risk of not implementing that control. And you do a risk assessment to determine what level that risk is, and then somebody at a sufficiently high enough level within the organization is going to accept that risk, and then you're going to carry on. So that's where the flexibility comes in. You can do what we call scoping guidance on the controls.
To Don's point about standards, there are many, many different kinds of, different standards. You have PCI, you have ITIL, you have NIST, you have COBIT, etc. The important thing is to pick one and stick with it as much as you can. And as Don was saying, you don't necessarily have to do every control within there, but you do the risk assessment and say we're going to accept, or we're just not going to do this one, or it doesn't apply. But the idea is to pick a standard that covers the broadest amount of what you are doing, and then supplement as needed, say PCI or HIPAA or some of the other more specific ones. But to focus on one, don't try and bring parts of ITIL and parts of COBIT and parts of ISO and parts of NIST. Pick one,
right,
and run forward with it.
Yeah, because if you just do a hodgepodge, what do you call that, like a smorgasbord or something like that, it's just not going to work. What you want to do is, like Ron says, pick one. And one of the reasons why I've always pushed back to NIST is ISO and NIST are very similar. If you look at the actual controls that you're looking at, but NIST has 3 different levels. They have a low, moderate, and high. So based upon the data that's on your system is whether or not your system is low risk, high risk, or moderate risk. And then you can implement controls that are in accordance to that. You have much more flexibility with NIST, I think, than you have with ISO, and it covers basically the same stuff for the most part. PCI is very similar to NIST as well. You can almost make a one-to-one, not quite, but you can almost make a one-to-one. This control relates to that control in NIST. The problem with PCI is they have very specific time frames that NIST doesn't have. NIST says you need to do a risk assessment to determine how often you should change your passwords. They're not going to dictate to you how often you have to change your passwords. PCI is going to dictate it. And so that's why I like the flexibility of it. But yeah, pick one, stick with it. Also, when we talk about standards and guidelines, your organization may have its own standards that it has. An example of a standard is whenever we're doing encryption, use AES encryption, 128-bit, or whatever it is. That would be a standard that your organization has. Technically, most people will put that into a policy, and so from a technical standpoint, from an academic, you would call that that's a standard. You're picking something and you're setting it up as a standard and it's a requirement. You may have it in a policy and you may not have it in a policy. It may be a separate document. So that's kind of like a different take on an internal standard. What I recommend most organizations do is if you're going to pick a standard, and if you look at my blog, I have a sample policy for local governments. It's very high level. It's made to make sure that all the departments are involved in the process and makes it like it's 1 page long cybersecurity policy. And basically it refers everything to NIST. And it says the city is going to implement NIST 853. So a board could pick that and say, okay, that's our cybersecurity policy, and then management's going to use 853. And then in there I put that you're going to be compliant with PCI and Department of Justice because local governments have to deal with that if they have a police force. So then you can pick standards or guidelines that you're going to then apply to your systems. Another example of a guideline which can show up in a how-to, or it can show up on a web page. It's part of your documentation, like how to tell end users to make complex passwords. So that's a guideline. So you can say, you don't have to do it this way, but we recommend that you do this X. So this example of a guideline is a way that organizations can have employees understand a different way of implementing it, right? So again, that guideline is flexible, and it's different than 853, but we use that same term, and I really want to say high-level industry guideline, 853, internal guideline, how to set up your passwords, because those are completely different creatures, even though we use the same word guideline on them in academics. And same thing with policies, standards like PCI, that's the industry standard. Your organization saying use AES encryption 256, that is more of a internal standard. So another thing to consider when you're doing your documentation is like, what should guide what I need to document? Well, part of that is you're going to have external factors that are going to kind of push into it beyond what the board has already, your governing board, whoever that is. You may have laws, directives, you may have a contract, what risks are out there, what threats, industry standards, industry guidelines, best practices, any MOU, MOAs you may have, service level agreements, anything else. So you have to kind of look at that and say, is there any of those things that should influence what policies and procedures we have? For example, big one is the California breach disclosure for local governments. One of the reasons is it covers license plate information as PII, or personally identifiable information. So you have to disclose if that was breached. So that should, one, tell you that that's a high-value target for someone trying to hack into it. But two, it's going to be a high impact if there's a breach there. And so you want to probably implement stronger controls around it. But the requirements in the law require disclosure, and you have to turn it into the Secretary of State, and you have to inform all the people that their information was compromised. If you're a local government, you probably don't want to deal with that, because you're going to have people showing up at council meetings all upset about something because there was a breach, and it may turn it into something bigger than it needs to be. But so you want to take all that other stuff out there and help that inform what you need to have as far as your documentation. Like, what is it? DOJ requires that you have instant response plan, right, and all that. So the other type of thing is all of these documents have a life cycle. And so just like the system development life cycle, you need to determine what you need. Those external factors is what you can put into there. You design it, draft those policies and procedures, get them approved, and then implement those. And part of implementing is make sure you communicate it to everybody and say, hey, our policy just changed. This is what it is. You may need to provide training for users if there's something that users need to understand and how to do. And then you need to monitor that policy. And what I mean monitor and evaluate it is it still applicable? I mean, I come in a lot of times as an auditor and I go and look at it and they say, hey, can you look at our policies? Or I'm there for another reason looking at the policies. And I look at something and then it's referencing Windows XP. I'm like, okay, when was the last time you updated this? Not anytime soon. Or if you're still running Windows XP, that's bad, right? So they need to be updated on a regular basis. And then you either need to retire those if they're no longer applicable or update them and go through the process again. So it's a life cycle approach. You should all be very familiar with it. It's the same life cycle approach we use with just about everything in IT. Just remember the documents also have a life cycle. So oftentimes I get asked, what is supposed to be, do you have a template for one? And yes, I have one on my blog. It's a little bit truncated. It's meant to be just like grab and go type of thing. Every organization is going to be different. Every organization is going to have this format of how they do policies. But the things that we look for as an auditor, and there's nice to haves and then there's must haves, right? The must have is you need to have the policy statement. You have to have that. Like, what are people supposed to do? Beyond that, a lot of these other things are like super really nice to haves. Like the first one is purpose and overview. What is the purpose of overview? Why do you have this policy? And I recommend, this is the nice to have, that you take that purpose and align it to your organization's mission and objectives, right? So why are we setting up cybersecurity? Well, because as a city, we want to provide these services to the, our voters. So that's where you're starting it. And maybe it's going to be a little bit more fleshed out than that, depending upon what the policy is. The scope and applicability, sorry, it's too early in the morning. What does this apply to? What is the scope? Is there any exclusions to this? Does it not apply? Does this apply to just the IT systems and not the OT systems, right? So if that is the case, you need to make sure that you say what it's applicable to. What is the scope? Your policy statement, roles and responsibilities. You need to assign roles. Who's in charge of this? Is there any governance? Is there any review of this? And who's in charge of the review process for this? So you may have roles and responsibility. You may have 5 or 6 people listed for roles and responsibilities for different aspects of this, policy. Exceptions. This one is always seems to be overlooked. If council decides there's not going to be any exceptions to this whatsoever, then you could put that in the policy. I recommend, though, that there is a process that you can have exceptions, because you may have a technology that doesn't apply to the type of policy that you have. Let's say you have a policy that says you're going to have complex passwords, and which I wouldn't say put into there. I put it at a lower level policy. But let's say you did, and then you get a new system, and it's multi-factor, and it's a PIN and your telephone number, or your telephone, right? And it's a multi-factor authentication. So the policy says you can't use that because it says you have to have complex password, and a PIN is not a complex password. Now, we all know that multi-factor authentication is better than a strong password. So how are exceptions going to be handled? So how should they be handled? Very briefly, whoever at the IT level, system admin level, sees that there's a problem with the policy, it cannot be applied, they should then forward that up to whoever the security people is, or they do a risk assessment to determine what is the impact of doing the exception. Is there another compensating control that we can put in place? They would then forward that up to the CIO, CISO, depending on what you have in your organization, or city manager or director, for them to review and approve it. So the policy should definitely line out what that process is, and then who has approval authority to approve an exception. And then council should also ask that they be notified of any of these exceptions. So yes, city manager can go ahead and sign off on it and do an exception to the policy, but then at the next council meeting that'll be brought up. So council wants to make sure in the governance side of things that they're being informed if their policies cannot be applied. And that may mean that they have to go back and look at that policy again, or maybe they just say, yeah, he did the right thing. That exception makes sense. Enforcements and violations, what are you going to do if someone violates the policy? Now that may exist in another policy. If you have an HR policy and it says all your policies and this is how we're going to deal with enforcement violations, then it's not in your policy here, it's in another one somewhere else. Limitations on liability, that one's typically on a terms of use or permissible behavior or rules of behavior that you may have, like for Wi-Fi or network use or all that kind of stuff, so there may be limits on liability. Approval and authorization, there should be some type of wording that says who approved this and how long is it good for. Is there a period of time that it's good for, or is it good forever, or until rescinded? References, I highly recommend you reference all the different documentation standards, all that external stuff we just talked about. You want to know what all of it is so that when you review it, you know why you have all these provisions there. And if one of those documents, PCI updates or NIST updates, you go back to it and say, is this still applicable? Let me go look at the source documents. If in the documents it tells you where the references are, it makes your life a lot easier in doing the review process. Definitions are really important. Define things, and then you can tidy up your wording. I see a lot of organizations, they'll be very redundant because they're not using standard definitions. And I recommend that you use the standard definitions that NIST has. You can go to csrc.nist.gov/glossary, I think is what it is. You can go look it up. They have a glossary of all the cybersecurity terms. Use their definitions. Don't make your own up. And then, because it confuses everybody, auditors and everybody else, we're looking for, when you say a certain thing, that's what we're thinking. So just use standard definitions, makes your life a lot easier. Finally, document history. The bottom of the document, you should say, anytime that this is approved or edited or changed, it should be documented who did it, and then was it approved. If you review the document, sign the document saying there was a review, put the date, and then put no change. If there was no change but you reviewed it, do that. Because as an auditor, I want to know that you're reviewing these things on a regular basis to make sure they're done. And if you've documented it, one, I'm golden because I can say, yes, they did it. And two, you have a written record or paper trail that you did do that part of the control. Because part of the control is making sure that you update those on a regular basis. So put all that in your policy and you have all your good stuff. And again, you want to make sure that that policy is in alignment with your overall mission and your enterprise level mission or your citywide or countywide or district-wide mission. You want to make sure everything is in alignment through their departments and an IT that is supporting all those departments, whether it's Parks and Rec or whatever it is. There's an overall mission that you're trying to make sure that these policies are helping you align with. So I did make a cybersecurity policy for local governments. It's a very high-level one. It's similar to a couple other cities that have, but I kind of tweaked it a little bit because I wanted to make sure that it had some certain type of wording. And basically that policy that you can go and look at and use as a template, I always recommend that you update it and change it to meet your needs. But to give you something to start with this, and then use it, and I made it as short as I possibly could. I mean, I couldn't make it any shorter if I tried. The idea is to make sure that you're pointing everybody to PCI, you're pointing everybody to NIST, you're pointing everybody to these other standards so that lower level policies can be made for access control, configuration management, incident response, all that other stuff can be put down at a lower level. This is a very high level one that the board can approve, and then staff can do the rest of them at a lower level. Because they're already telling you, do 853. So now there's no question. You know what you got to do. You got your 200 and some odd different controls that you have to implement for a moderate level system, so you implement it. That's what you want to do, some type of thing like that. If you have nothing. If you have something, you may want to kind of look at it and see, like one of my clients had their terms of use, or acceptable use policy, which is what end users have to sign that they agree to do, but then they have all these other policies as a part of it. And unfortunately, you're having someone sign something saying that they understand it, but then in that policy that talks about that they can only use incidental use of city computers, you also have incident response, which for the end users, their job, the only thing they have to do is if they suspect something, they say something, report it, who they report it to. But then they have all this other information that end users try to read and say, I'm signing something, I don't even understand what it is. So you want to make sure that that terms of use is a separate policy and it's just for that. And it covers all the stuff that they need to have. In the NIST framework, risk management framework in the federal government, we call that a rules of behavior. Some organizations call it terms of use. There's different names for it, but anyways, that's what we're basically looking for. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, nothing. And then people are always asking, what topics do I have to cover in all of this? What kind of policy should I have? Well, there's an extensive list. Okay. And I don't have a blog post for this yet. I have to kind of go through it. This is just a sample of a list that we have. And basically looking at NIST 853, looking at PCI DSS, and looking at NIST Cybersecurity Framework, you just basically go through it and look at all the places that says document this or have a policy or procedure for this, and then now you know what you need to have policies and procedures for. And by the way, most of the NIST things, if you go to the families of controls, AC1, access control family, AC1, that control, is have a policy and procedure for access control. And then AT1, which is awareness and training, is have a policy and procedure. So the NIST is really easy. Just look at the first one of every one of them, and that's telling you to do that. PCI is a little bit harder because a lot of the controls throughout the entire document, it used to be the section 12 was all about policies and procedures, but if you look throughout the entire document, there's policies and procedures at different levels for different things. So you just have to kind of grind through it and see what needs to be documented and not. And the cybersecurity framework kind of dovetails really closely to 853, the current version of it, which is 4. 5 is supposed to integrate the cybersecurity framework into it, along with privacy controls. So it's in draft right now, but that's what the goal is to kind of pull those together. And they're doing the risk management framework's also being updated. So 837, which is how the risk management framework works, is also in the process of being updated. And they're going to add privacy to it. And they're also going to add a new, it's not a new step, there's still 6 steps, but there's an overlay to all of it in the current draft of planning. So planning becomes a part of the whole entire shooting match. Anyways, so I don't know, I didn't have any questions. Did you have any final thing to add, Ron? Or I'm not sure that there was a, Rob, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is start small, but keep the big picture in mind. Don't try and boil the ocean. If you don't have anything in place, simply start by getting your governing body to agree that A, cybersecurity is something they should be caring about and paying attention to, and adopt a framework. Then next year come back and say, okay, now we need to do the next level. And the next year we've got to come back and do the next level. And do it on a risk-based approach. Don't try and boil the ocean.
Right. And I think you could tell me from an auditor standpoint, I see it all the time, is that it's not, you can't go in and say, oh, here's the 200 and some odd controls, I need a budget for this year.
No, you're never going to get that. You have to start small, and you have to demonstrate the value. And that's where your supporting documentation, your history, your statistics, all comes into play. The idea is to get in front of it before something happens so that you can point back and say, well, see, we've been talking about this. Now we've had this event. This means we need to do this. And now you've got the history, you've got the credibility, and you've got the data to back up and help you tell the story.
And I think that's a good point, because in cybersecurity, we don't talk about if something's going to happen. We talk about when it's going to happen. And the thing is, if you already have addressed it and they've already adopted a standard and you're in the process of implementing it, but you haven't implemented everything, if you show them, hey, these are all the controls we have in place, this is one of the other controls that we've asked for budget for, and we still haven't got it, and that's the control that, if it was in place, would have prevented that, you're going to keep your job, right? If you don't do anything, then it's what we call a career-ending move, right? Because they're going to be like, why didn't you tell us about this?
Resume-generating event.
Yes. So thank you all for attending, and go ahead and please rate us and rate this event, and go ahead and go to our blog and check out some of the blog posts. There's a bunch of them about policies covering everything that I talked about today. And also, if you have a question or you would like to add some feedback, you can go to my blog and send an email from there. Just let me know if there's anything else you want to talk about in the future also. We're always up for ideas. With that, goodbye.